Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Is Moving a Manufacturing Program from China to Mexico Right for My Business? This webinar is brought to you by Medical Design and Outsourcing and Eastech International Corporation. We've got a few quick housekeeping details before we start. You'll see several boxes on your desktop, all of which can be moved around to suit your preferences. You can enter your questions in the Q&A box, and they will be addressed after the presentation. Another box to note is the additional resources box, where you can find the slides from today's presentation. Finally, this webinar will be available for replay online at medicaldesignandoutsourcing.com. If you're watching this on replay, you can still enter questions and our experts will get back to you. I'm Jim Hammerand. I'm the managing editor of Medical Design Outsourcing, and I'll be your moderator. Please allow me to thank our presenters for being here today. Welcome to Bill Boyer, EVP, Global Manufacturing at Eastech International Corporation. Bill's got more than 40 years of experience working in the electronics manufacturing industry, starting his career with the medical OEM as a high schooler. He later worked in contract manufacturing and eventually launched his own company, Automated Circuit Technology, and sold it to Eastech. Let's also welcome Dave Rioni, Eastech President and COO. Dave previously led privately held lighting and electrical companies, ran Eastech's engineering and operations functions, and worked in operations at GE Plastics. Finally, we've got Ron Rigel, VP of Engineering at Eastech. Ron has led engineering services and turnkey product launches for complex electromechanical assemblies. He's helped customers launch new products and orchestrated manufacturing moves from China to Eastech's facilities in Mexico. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. With that, and without further ado, I will hand the presentation over to our experts. Take it away.
Good morning, everybody. I'll get started. Eastech International is a U.S.-based company out of Lake Zurich, Illinois, owned and operated global contract manufacturer offering world-class manufacturing. Capabilities are PCBA assemblies, tooling design and fabrication, turnkey assembly, and many other opportunities that we can help you out with. We have facilities in our original location started out in Dongguan, China, and we have a location also in Malaysia and Mexico most recently. Eastech has the capability of building electromechanical subassemblies to complete custom products with high standards, including ISO 13485 and medical FDA approved product. We also have sales offices and marketing in Europe, and we have warehousing in Hong Kong. Our manufacturing, you can see on the map, Dongguan, China, Malaysia, and then also in Mexico. Headquarters on the map, Illinois. Things to focus on and go over, factors that are driving manufacturing out of China. Just kind of to go over briefly some of the items that are pushing people out of China include labor costs through the years. We've been in China since '92, and over the last 10 plus years, we have seen labor costs increase substantially. Regulatory complexities and uncertainties within the country create issues and concerns. And then we all saw the tariff impact that hit 3 years, 4 years ago now. And then some of the geopolitical situations between the US and China have also made things more difficult in China. And then right now it's been stable, but and have come down to more reasonable costs, but unpredictable freight cost as we saw containers go from $3,500 per container to some containers at the peak over $30,000. And then another thing that I think everybody learned, that the over-dependency on one country to manufacture product the dependency that we all had on getting product out of China and trying to diversify and mitigate risks. We've all been focused on trying to do that the past few years. Our focus has been, what makes Mexico a good alternative location for manufacturing. And some of the things that we've learned over the years, labor cost can be as much as 20% lower. Where we find that more so is in the area of direct labor. We have been finding lower costs with direct labor. Industrial lease space, we have seen increases in China. With that, we have found lower cost for leasing space or purchasing space, manufacturing space in Mexico compared to China. Transportation costs, obviously lower cost, less product on the water. Overall, it can be as much as 70% less for transportation cost, Mexico compared to China. And if your factory requires any kind of, natural gas or any facility cost, you'll find that in Mexico, that's typically lower cost. Mexico has been very good. They're pro-business government, and there's 45 global trade agreements in place, including the USMCA. And trade has been easy to be done in Mexico, North America. There's a well-established manufacturing base. Automotive industry has been in Mexico for many, many years. Aerospace has been, heavy equipment, and even consumer products. I think the consumer products are growing, but automotive, aerospace, and heavy equipment have been there for many, many, many years. There is a good skilled workforce in Mexico that have experience in electronic assembly, molding, castings, overall assembly, wire harness. Again, a lot of years of background experience in those areas in Mexico. Obviously, it's convenient access to the U.S. market, same time zone, easy travel. You can decide to go there tomorrow and get there, and it's much more easy travel on either engineering or customer travel. The other, it facilitates a strategy for diversifying and nearshoring, which we're finding that there's a lot of customers pushing for that, wanting to do that. And it's been a trend, and it's obviously, why everybody's on this call, I think, trying to learn what to do and how to do it. Current state of manufacturing. So in Mexico, there's over $100 billion of exports in cars and car and parts. There's been that industry, the automotive industry, has been there, 50 years plus. There's $10 billion in electrical appliances being exported annually, $100 billion in electronics exported annually, including consumer products. And then there's a strong presence, again, in the automotive, aerospace, processing equipment, in related industries. There are good supply chain, and we'll touch on that in a second, but there's thousands of suppliers to support metal, plastics, PCBA, wire harness, and assembly. There is a good, solid supply chain within Mexico. Geographically, Mexico has areas that are concentrated areas based on the industry. So certain cities, certain areas, certain states within Mexico will focus on certain segments of the industry. There's benefits and challenges both to those situations. On the labor side of things, general labor can be lower cost compared to China, and there's some benefits, and again, where the typically the lower cost have come into play is in the direct labor side of it. Labor situation. So things that we considered when we moved there: border towns, large cities, central Mexico, all those have a bearing on what labor costs are. And if you're near the borders or the large cities, typically they're higher wages and more turnover. We at Eastech have a situation where we're below 1% turnover. Doing medical product, we've got to make sure that we have consistent employees. And we have found that the location we have picked, we have very low turnover. You get into some of the border towns in larger cities, you can see as much as 12 to 15% turnover per month. So you've got to make a decision on what you can live with turnover, and understand that before you pick a location in Mexico. Employees, again, depending on the location, they will go to another job due to small increases and shorter commutes. So something else to keep in mind, that location that you picked for your facility has an impact on maintaining employees, and it can be a challenge. The other thing that can impact wages and competitiveness in maintaining and holding on to employees is that automotive presence is huge in Mexico, and that can influence the wages, maintaining and retaining employees. So again, understanding where you're moving, what competition you have for employees within that region or area is very important to understand that. On the supply chain side of it, like labor, the supply chain is available in Mexico. It can vary significantly, by region and component material availability. Certain areas are supported much better in molding. Certain areas do a better job at electronic assembly. So again, it goes back to location that you're choosing in Mexico. Compared to China, it's going to take a long time if Mexico is ever able to develop that supply chain, but it's less extensive than what we're used to in China. it's there, it's established, but there's not as many options. For example, plastic resins, there's plenty of distribution there, but we've run into issues where on specialty grades, we still may need to go to China and have it shipped into Mexico because of availability and or cost. It's still at times cheaper to go through China. Electronic components, again, that's through normal distribution for the most part. Wherever you are, the electronics industry is pretty similar. There are situations where the electronic components can be more costly in the Americas versus China, or availability, and you still need to source some of those parts from China. Metal parts, China does subsidize metal and raw materials. We have found that it's one of those areas that it's not as competitive on the raw material cost in Mexico, and we are finding that we still need to source some of those metal products out of China still. With the rapid growth over the last couple of years in Mexico, there has been some issues with that supply chain. If you're doing smaller volumes, high mix, low volume product, it can be very difficult to get engaged with localizing a supplier to provide you even quotes or entertaining the opportunity to place business and try to localize it. And it's because they're so busy with everybody reshoring, and it's created the opportunity for them to be selective in what they pick as an opportunity for themselves. We've run into situations where you just get a no bid, and you have to continue to work with your China supply chain. Over time, I think that'll improve, but it can be a struggle, something to keep in mind. Suppliers, again, it's a relationship, and they at times don't respond to emails or phone calls just because they are that busy with new programs and new opportunities. And you kind of need to get boots on the ground to go visit those suppliers to get their attention. And what you would normally do, providing them a request for a quote, doesn't always work. They're at times difficult to find solutions to localizing that supply chain. Manufacturing, moving to Mexico, you may have to, once you get your operation up and running, you may need to keep that supply chain in place that you currently have and provide those materials to Mexico from China. So keep that supply chain in place, and then as time moves on and you get it established, then migrate to the Mexico suppliers. So the point there with that move, it might be a good idea to not disrupt your current supply chain, get moved, and then migrate your supply chain to Mexico. If you try to do both at the same time, could be difficult, could create problems and shutdowns. Logistically, generally speaking, there's good infrastructure in Mexico. They've been doing it for years. I think at times they can get overwhelmed today. There's so much of it. They're expanding and trying to improve, but things overall in general have been very good. You can get product shipped from central Mexico to the border town, typically in a day, sometimes less. That typically isn't, a big issue there. There's 5 major seaports in Mexico. Manzanillo is on the Pacific coast. Veracruz is on the Gulf Coast. 2 very large seaports coming into Mexico. Logistically, the U.S. carriers provide, coverage for Mexico freight, but likely to have specific requirements. And what we have found, so the U.S. carriers providing insurance and coverage, they may have requirements. For example, they may want 2 drivers, GPS tracking, the driver to have a cell phone. There's specific requirements for that transportation in Mexico, and nothing too major, but something to be aware of. In most cases, the trucking companies within Mexico provide that 2 drivers and the GPS tracking and cell phones standard. Customs and trade issues. Much like China, Mexico loves the forms and the documentation. It's not always easy. There's a lot to it, and you've got to be an expert to get product moved through, and have someone in customs to help you out in those situations. We have found importing new equipment generally goes very smooth, but if you're looking at importing used equipment, let's say from China, first of all, it may be difficult to get it out of China. Secondly, it can be difficult to get it imported into Mexico. We have found that, we imported a bunch of equipment and tabletop workstations, but when we went to try to import warehouse racking, we couldn't get warehouse racking into the country. So there's little things that you need to work through when it specifically comes to used equipment more so. The other thing that can be difficult is trying to get samples and or prototypes into the country. There's documentation requirements and a good understanding of what the equipment is and what it's used for to get it imported. Sounds trivial, but it can be complicated and can be time consuming. It can get hung up in customs for weeks, if not months at times. So you've got to understand what you're importing and have all the correct documentation needed to get it in. Speed is an urgency. Again, planning is most important. Don't assume you can just get something down there in a week. Physically, yes, shipping can get it down there in a week, but again, it can just get hung up in customs. We have run into issues despite what UPS and FedEx will tell you. There are struggles at times with both providers getting materials moved around. Specific import restrictions can pop up randomly. Unknowns. We tried to get new computers shipped in. They were reprogrammed or loaded with software and firmware from our customer, and just trying to get those imported in. You know, they'll take a laptop and power it up, and they're warn you that they may damage or corrupt that computer and it not work. So they're trying to get you to purchase computers within country. They don't like computers coming into country, imported in. So again, one of those things that, you know, you can run into situations, and documentation and reasons why become very important. Tariff avoidance, again, understanding substantial transformation. You can go on the USMCA website and read through Chapter 4 and try to understand, you know, the percentage of transformation to avoid any kind of tariffs or import fees. It's typically in that, depending on the calculation you use, is 50 to 60% transformation to be performed within Mexico to avoid any tariffs. But it's an area where you need a customs expert and someone to help you through that process. And there's experts out there that offer that ability to help you out on understanding, you know, those requirements. But it's gone well for us. We've been able to avoid tariffs in all cases so far. We bounced past. Okay, so top manufacturing industries in Mexico. I'll just quickly, I'm not going to read all this, but their aerospace has been there for a long time. 300 aerospace manufacturing companies, including OEMs, tier 1, 2, and 3 suppliers. Automotive industry, again, they've been there for 50 plus years, manufacturing automotives and automotive sub-assemblies and parts. Medical devices, there's roughly $8 billion of medical devices exported out of Mexico. And overall, the electronic industry has grown and is well established in aerospace, high tech, IT, electronic sub-assemblies, computer parts, appliances, home goods, and medical product. And then the appliance industry has been in Mexico for many, many years. And it's the 5th largest export in the world for appliances out of Mexico. This is just the kind of a map to show you areas that are concentrated with clusters of manufacturing and kind of hotspots of manufacturing. The light blue zone is the concentrated areas of popular areas for manufacturing in those locations. That's really it for that map. I think I am done.
Yeah, I guess I'm next here.
Yep.
Okay, what I'm going to talk about, this is Dave Rioni. I'm going to take what Bill talked about, gave us a good overview of Mexico in general, and start to get a little more specific about moving a program that's currently in China to a Mexico operation. And then Ron is going to get one more level of detail as far as specifics and information. So the first thing to think about for moving a program is what's driving the transfer, because that may have some implications on the way that you go about this. We see drivers being things like the tariff avoidance Bill talked about, or supply chain continuity, and those can be fairly urgent issues that you want to get resolved, or maybe it's more of a general corporate de-risking policy, and so that might allow a longer timeline. But those are important things to think about because it might influence the rest of the steps and decision points that come up as you move through the project. The next thing that's really important, and Ron's going to touch on this as well, is what kind of current situation and relationship do you have with your China supplier? If you have a good relationship and you can be transparent about your intention to move the production out of China, then really that's the best case because you can work together, you can be open about your planning, and that's likely to go much more smoothly, quicker, and less expensive than if you have to do it without tipping your hand. So unfortunately, that initial situation is much less common. And what happens is we see clients who really need to do this, confidentially and quietly, and then notify their China supplier, almost at the last minute. Maybe there's a last time buy or something like that, but or even some parallel time where you're ramping them down and ramping up in Mexico. But that second scenario, unfortunately, is going to take longer, and it's going to be more expensive because you're going to have to basically reinvest in that production program. Along the lines with that issue is the intellectual property. So this is another thing that becomes very important. And if you're in that latter category where you've got to do this, more or less quietly, if you don't have a good grip on all the IP, that again is going to make that much more difficult. And what we see pretty often is that if a program has been with a China supplier for a long time, what happens over that period is obviously there's product changes. The company may have engineers in and out of that program, and so what happens is the supplier actually has the most thorough and up-to-date documentation on the products. So unfortunately, we've been in a situation with several clients where we had to replicate their own IP just so they could start looking for supply chain options. And obviously that takes a long time and can get expensive. So that the status and accuracy of your product documentation is really critical when you think about moving. The next thing, of course, is capital. So this is more or less your just kind of your typical things. Obviously, the facility costs, but then equipment, as Bill talked about, computer systems. All things that you think might be simple could be challenging. QA and testing equipment, and just all the other infrastructure that you need to support manufacturing. You may find that this is prohibitive, and then you need to maybe reevaluate the manufacturing methods or the supply chain and look for other options. Another area that kind of relates to that is anything specialized. And again, with the program maybe going on for many years in China, it's likely that your China supplier has develop some very specific equipment or fixtures, or maybe worked to develop a very specific supply chain for you. And replicating that, may be very difficult. So understanding those issues will help you identify where you have that situation. Obviously, tooling and molds and fixtures, test equipment, all the stuff that's required to make your product. If you're working transparently, maybe those things can be transferred, or a lot of them can be. But again, that's not the norm. And so you may end up replicating all these things and having to make that investment so that you can have all the necessary equipment and related things in Mexico to produce your product. The supply chain is really key. Again, you really want to go through your entire bill of materials to understand what can be sourced locally, what might present challenges, and what the costs might look like between China and Mexico. Because of the complexity and the risk, we do often start a transfer program, but continue to use the China-based supply chain, and then develop the local sources over time. So that's a good way to de-risk and maybe make your initial costs a little more predictable. But then later you can, look to optimize that. And what you'll probably find is it's going to be a mix. Your supply chain is going to be a mix of things that may continue to have to come from Asia. Another important area is certain things like paints and coatings and finishes on metal. Those may have been developed by a China supplier without a lot of documentation or clear specs. And so those get very tricky to understand, and reproduce on the other side of the world. The transfer schedule is key. Inventory transition planning, again, how you do this and over what time frame will bring these, some of these issues to light. One key question will be whether you run with dual sources for a period of time, or maybe make a clean break. So it really comes down to risk, costs, and maybe your ability to carry some extra inventory for a time period will help determine the right path here. Something Bill touched on that's going to be critical on tariff avoidance in particular, although I think just knowing what the import-export implications of your product coming out of Mexico are going to be. But specifically for tariff avoidance, you're going to have to consider whether or not your product will qualify for essentially made in Mexico status, and then it can enjoy the benefits of USMCA. So there's essentially two ways to do this. One is to demonstrate that the exported value of the product includes the required labor content under USMCA. Those were originally initiated for the auto industry, but now they kind of roll into all the other manufactured goods that might be imported to the U.S. from Mexico. And another way to do this is demonstrating something that's referred to as substantial transformation, which basically means that you're converting all the parts from something that they come in as to a different product. So the HTS codes that your China materials are imported into Mexico are then converted into a different HTS code for the product exported. A simple example is like sugar and flour that might be imported to Mexico, and then you bake that into a loaf of bread, and that bread has a different HTS code. So you've substantially transformed that product. So if you can demonstrate either of these, you can. It's likely then you can avoid the punitive tariffs. But again, every one of these is a case by case, and it really requires some expert analysis. But the bottom line is this is important, because if you can't prove this, then even if you're importing materials into Mexico, making a product, and then importing that into the U.S., you'll still be subject to the punitive tariffs. And obviously you don't want to go through all this trouble and have that remain. Certifications are going to be important. Again, if your medical products, you're going to need FDA and maybe 13485 in the factory, IATF for automotive. Even your UL file will need to be updated with the new location. So that's certainly an issue. You'll have process validation and audit issues at the new location. Basically, it's going to be a new facility, new equipment running your product. And so you're kind of starting from scratch there. And then you get through all of these things and you're finally ready to do some cost modeling and determine the expected Ex Works unit cost to your product. You may see potential increases in some areas, offset by reductions in labor and operating expense and freight. But even if your Mexico cost is higher, when you look at the big picture and think about obviously tariff, but risk and the carrying cost of higher inventories due to the long transit time, you really got to look at the big picture before as part of making a no-go decision. Okay, Ron, turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Dave. Thanks, Bill, for kind of covering the key considerations here. So I'll just cover the last section here, which is what's needed when you prepare to build your model and ultimately your quote, and if it makes sense here. And it kind of overlaps here, but I'll try to take it in one notch more detail here. So first aspect is to establish the type of transfer and the scope. So we refer to that as either a collaborative transfer or a second source type transfer or some combination thereof. As Dave mentioned, it's more likely, at least from what we've seen in our experience, it's a second source type of transfer, but let me kind of talk through those. So for collaborative transfer, what that, obviously that's ideal. And really what that means is having access to the current manufacturer, visiting their site, sharing work instructions, supply chain, tooling that could be transferred. And often that's needed all the way throughout, right? As we go through the process, there may be questions that come up later. And to the extent that we have access through the process, certainly that's ideal. As I mentioned before, more likely it would be perhaps treated as a second source transfer, where we would be developing processes independent of the current supplier, and that's everything from supply chain sources, tooling, specs, work instructions, routings, and so on. The other thing I would mention here is even on the collaborative transfer, keep in mind that rarely will the product transfer with the exact same processes, routing, and work instructions. So I think earlier on, Bill mentioned, for example, stamping, metal stamping. We've had experience in the past where maybe we originally intended to transfer that right away from the get-go. And as we evaluated, we realized at least for an interim, we would keep the stamping with a supplier in China. And let me kind of illustrate kind of a before and after. So maybe the original process, the stamping, simple stamping could be done at the current supplier. They stamp it in-house, and they might walk over 20, 30 feet to the next operation, whether it's overmolding or heat stake or what have you. When we transfer, we may still buy from a local supplier in China, but obviously then, the handling of that becomes a little bit more substantial, right, in terms of how we quote it, how we ship it and package it, get it to the Mexico facility to do the value add and additional processes. The other thing I would mention is kind of just a lessons learned. There may be instances where one can buy either tooling or test fixtures or even work instructions from the existing supplier, which obviously could save a lot of time, not reinventing the wheel on a particular process or underlying test or so on. Although I would caution to not to wait too long on that. So we've had an instance where we're kind of hoping that would come through, and as time went on, kind of in the end, it kind of didn't come through. So just be careful on waiting too long there. And then in terms of the model, it's what you would expect and mentioned before. We've got our costs that we want to build up, both in terms of the substantial transformation and tariffs, and then the overall manufacturing costs there. And again, I consider what might stay in China in terms of subcomponents, at least in the interim. Metal fabrication, for example. So we build up the cost model there, and then capital equipment and supply chain planning. On that aspect, what I'll touch on is planning for a bank build, for example. So typically one would expect you'd plan for a bank build, however many weeks or months that you feel is appropriate for cushion before you transfer over to Mexico. And I think, as we all know, through COVID times, it may not be so easy to get components for that bank build. We may have a situation where we've got enough to keep up with production, but maybe not enough to truly do a bank build. So some of the things that we've done there to compensate for that might include planned expedited freight. So in other words, when you're transferring across the ocean, maybe in a standard case, you would have planned for shipping time by ocean and not paid for that expedite. But if you're short on components, that might be a reasonable alternative. Also, we've looked at doubling up or reproducing fixtures, maybe so we can do a lift build in advance in Mexico, again, because our ability to get components might be limited. So then from there, once we kind of build that up, the last section is really the list of things, the checklist. Obviously, there's much more detail that can go behind this, but the list and things that we would need to prepare the model, as effectively as possible. The typical things that you would expect: specifications, drawings, bill of material, tooling, design files, and so on. Production test, sometimes that's a weak area in terms of the information, a lot of tribal knowledge and know-how that can occur at the existing facility. And then, of course, don't forget the qualifications and agency. We've got a lead time for that, whether it's UL, qualifications like PPAP, shipping samples back and forth. And then the commercial aspects, MOQ, Incoterms, expected life of the program, and so on. And for that section, a couple notes that I would make is, there's kind of pros and cons when you transfer a program. One of the pros that might come up is, okay, this is a product that's already in production. One might perceive that it's proven, it's debugged, and so on, and that's the good news. But as I mentioned before, the process oftentimes changes a bit, and from that aspect, or there's tribal knowledge that we've got to uncover and kind of requalify. And for those items, oftentimes the original team that developed that product is no longer there. So getting access to the true history of information might not be as trivial, and we might build in some time for that. And then as Dave mentioned, we've had instances where there might be variation between suppliers. So resins might be slightly different in color. Another one might be plating where it doesn't solder exactly the same, and we might just have to modify some of the parameters to dial that in. We've had other instances where drawings were outdated. That's kind of an obvious one. We've had an instance where the drawings were actually correct, but let's say we uncovered on the drawing a interference fit on a particular part. We felt that it must be wrong. Maybe it's an old drawing, and long story short, we found out that the drawing was correct, and the current supplier was just managing it internally. So that might be something we want to correct as we go through the process. So to kind of summarize it up and kind of finish up here, I'd say, typical projects, there's things that come up. We just need to be prepared to roll up our sleeves and solve these issues and leave enough time in between to have a successful launch. So with that, let me go back to the agenda and hand it over to Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Ron and Bill and Dave. It was a great presentation, lots of useful, available information there. So we're going to open up to questions now. Feel free to send us your questions in the Q&A box, and we already have some to start, so let's get into it. And I think this first one is probably a good question for Dave. Let me pull it up here. All right. Is there a specific area, town, or city in Mexico where most of the electrical or electronic manufacturing is concentrated?
I would say, I think the Baja region is kind of known as a hub for electronics, and most of the big guys have facilities there. Foxconn is there, and a lot of that's up in Tijuana. So that would be probably one answer. Although I think, today, if you look at a map of where electronics are made, it's really all over the country, and it's, to support the manufacturing clusters. So there's certainly important, manufacturing for electronics in other parts of the country, specifically central Mexico, kind of south central Mexico, Jalisco area, Chihuahua, and the like. So I would say it's pretty spread out, but with a concentration in the Baja region.
All right, very good, thank you. Here's a question for anyone who wants to grab it on timing. About how long does it take to transfer a program from China to Mexico?
It depends on the product and your situation. If you're transferring tools, if you got to build a bank build before you transfer a program, or it's a new program, but typically, that 4 to 9 month time frame is typical, and it's going to depend again on your program.
Another question just came in from the audience. Are there any language considerations to be aware of depending on the location of Mexico?
We have found, many of the people, including the lead people, supervisors, all speak English very well. We've not had any concerns or issues related to the language difference.
Okay. What about working hours in Mexico? How does that differ?
So first shift, typically they work a 48-hour week, and then second shift works a 42-hour week, and same with third shift, typically will overlap and work a 42-hour week. Even in some cases, that third shift may be a 30-hour week for them only. So it can vary, but typically 48 hours or 42 hours for that second and or third shift.
Okay, very good.
I think there is some potential with a lot. There's been a lot of activity labor wise with the current president in Mexico, and I think the next thing on his slate is maybe reducing that work week. That hasn't been implemented yet, but it's likely.
Yep.
Very good. We've got a question about the availability of degreed or experienced people in Mexico. Again, this one's open for anyone who wants it.
The availability, it again depends on your area, where you're located. Monterey, for example, there's a lot of people available. It's a competitive environment in that region, in that area. But Mexico has done a great job at, teaching, training, schooling, educating new people. So I really haven't seen an issue with it. In some cases, you might have to relocate someone depending on position to your location, but we've not had any trouble with filling positions.
I think we've got time for probably one more question here, but I do want to remind our attendees that if you haven't had a chance to get a question in, please get in now, and we'll reach out to you after the presentation. Last question though, how easy is it to visit the factories in Mexico compared to China?
I could take that because it's really easy. It's infinitely easier, I would say. A trip to China is, now with less direct flights, you're probably looking at almost 24 hours of continuous travel to get, from your home airport to your factory in China. Depending on where you are in Mexico, you can be on site in 4 hours. I mean, we're fortunate that we can fly direct from Chicago to Zacatecas, where our facility is located. So we leave in the morning, we're there, for lunch. And it's not only easier on us, it's a lot easier to get, in other internal support teams, engineering and so forth. But then it's also a lot easier to get customers to both commit to a visit and actually take that visit, because it's really convenient.
Sounds good. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions on this webinar. But once again, if you didn't have a chance to submit your question or to get an answer to a question that you submitted, you can reach out to the presenters directly. So thanks again to Bill, Dave, and Ron for being here, and to all our attendees for joining us. And thanks to ESTEC for sponsoring this webinar. This presentation will be emailed to everyone tomorrow, and we'll have it available for replay at our website, medicaldesignandoutsourcing.com. So we hope to see you soon at another Medical Design and Outsourcing webinar. Thanks to everyone once again, and we hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.